Hello, everyone. Election season is nearly upon us here in Alberta, and while it hasn't formally been called yet, it is scheduled and expected to take place on May 29th. And that is why we have launched albertadecides.com. This will be the URL that you can go to ensure that you are an informed voter. You'll be able to access all of our exclusive interviews and in-depth coverage as Alberta decides who will lead this province moving forward. Adam Soos here for Rebel News, and I'm joined here by a familiar face. Many of you who have been watching Rebel News, particularly those Alberta-focused stories, will recognize Tariq Elnaga. You are someone who basically came to the Stampede just over a decade ago, fell in love with everything about Alberta, moved here. You've become about just as Albertan as anybody I know, but you didn't just sort of fall in love with this concept. And then move here and sort of enjoy it. You've been an ardent defender. You've been politically active. You ran with the leadership race for the Maverick party. And you've also taken to commenting on very much the sort of, whether it be the Western rodeo lifestyle, the political scene in Alberta, conservatism, all those reasons that you picked this as the place where you wanted to live. You've been sort of an ardent defender. One of the sort of biggest ways that Albertan culture is affected is based on, maybe not on a day-to-day level or for individuals, but is the elections. Yeah. Elections can have a massive sway on everything from economic to cultural aspects of Alberta's life. So we're actually going to fortunately have Tariq with us for a couple of videos. And for this first video, which is part of our in-depth and sort of exclusive coverage on Alberta elections, which are set, at least not formally declared, but expected and scheduled for May 29th. I wanted to sort of lay the landscape for people out there so they're informed and they know how this election could shake down as to where this election ultimately will be decided. So I wanted to look at a couple different areas and see if you thought this is sort of a sensible way to break it down. And then we can go into each one of those areas. So as far as sort of voting blocks, I think it's probably reasonable to categorize them as the sort of rural vote, the Edmonton vote, and then the Calgary vote. Do you think that's fair?
That's bang on, Adam. So thanks for that intro. You're absolutely bang on. If the way I would divide the 87 seats in Alberta, you've got 20 in Edmonton, 41 in the rural areas, and 26 in Calgary. And that's really how you're going to be breaking it down. Everyone's looking obviously at the two leading figures. That's Danielle Smith and Rachel Notley. But Premier Smith and Rachel Notley will individually win their seats by huge margins. So it comes down now to the individual candidates in the individual seats rather than is it Premier Smith versus Notley.
Yeah, right. So when we're talking about those individual sort of seats, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems generally the rural areas will overwhelmingly go UCP. That's not a major battleground. Is that right?
Absolutely. So, we're in my home riding. Thanks for coming here. And Airdrie East and Angela Pitt, the MLA here for the UCP, won it by a gigantic margin and will very much likely win it again by a gigantic margin. If you look at rural seats, like, for example, Drumheller Stettler, which is Nate Horner's riding the Minister of Agriculture, he won it by, I think, 74% of the vote. So very, very deep margins in the rural areas. There are one or two rural seats that are very close. If you think of, for example, Lethbridge, Lethbridge is pretty tight, and there's some areas around Edmonton that are pretty close. But for the vast majority, rural Alberta is going to be, I think, a blue sweep.
Now, Edmonton, quite the opposite?
Edmonton is actually quite the opposite. So of the 20 seats in Edmonton today, 19 of them are orange. And there's only one that's blue, Casey Madu. I think it's going to be close, if that. Again, you almost look at the UCP and you feel like they've kind of resigned themselves to the fact that Edmonton's going to be an all-orange town. I understand the reasons why. It's a lot of public sector workers and what have you. But again, Edmonton's 20 seats. Now, there are, in fairness, a couple of UCP candidates. One I've been following, very proud of him, Syed Ahmed, who's been working incredibly hard to change Edmonton decor over from orange to blue. So there are a couple of candidates out there that are working really hard, but I suspect Edmonton's going to come out pretty orange of those 20 seats.
And ultimately, rural, you're talking about one or two potentially. Right. Edmonton, you're talking about one or two maybe going the other way. That will not be the deciding ground.
Absolutely.
And I mean, we can learn from our histories. Before we talk about what might happen in Calgary, let's talk about what happened last time.
Right.
In Calgary. The notion of a NDP government in Alberta was considered absurd.
Absolutely.
And it happened. Can you offer some insight as to how it happened?
Absolutely. So 2015, and the reason why it happened had a number of reasons. One, if you looked at the old PCs, it was in disarray. So it was sadly a lot of complacent politicians who were more left-leaning than they were centrist, at least. And they kind of took it for granted that Albertans, who are you going to vote for anyways? And with the whole debacle at the time of the floor crossing, the leadership changes that happened, etc., we either saw the NDP come up the middle, where people didn't vote for the NDP but came up the middle, or the protest votes. People were like, "Oh, we're so sick of the PCs and their complacency," that they ended up voting for the NDP. I'll still call it an accidental win for the NDP. I do not think it was an intentional win. And that's just my personal opinion, Adam. But I really think that we got a pretty solid vote split that came up through Calgary, came up through some, but not many, rural seats. And it was truly accidental, I think. And if you look at some seats, clearly, if you added the Wildrose and PC votes together, it was a clear conservative win, if you want to call it conservative ideology. But yeah, that's what happened in 2015. So it's very important that we don't see that. I mean, Jason Kenney, for all of his challenges over the last few years, if there's one thing I think that he successfully did right is bring the two parties together and absolutely decimate the NDP in 2019.
And so you said that like Calgary was part of that sort of, whether it be a protest vote or an accidental place, but that's where a good deal of the swing sort of took place. Does it seem like for this upcoming election, which is coming faster than most of us probably imagine, do you think that it'll be Calgary that ultimately decides who leads the province moving forward?
100%. Calgary will be the only deciding factor of the provincial race this year. Now, the demographics and the way Calgary votes today in 2023 is quite different than in 2019, I think. So it's very difficult to equate that. There's a lot more people that didn't grow up with, let's say, the oil and gas industry in Calgary. There's a lot of people. Alberta's seen the highest net provincial migration into the province in the country. So there's a lot of folks that have moved here from other provinces that may not understand why Alberta is Alberta, why we have 5% GST, why we have the lowest taxes, why we're entrepreneurial that way. So I would say that Calgary is definitely going to be the battleground of where it is. You see it with both parties. Both parties have focused their efforts on Calgary. The NDP, I think, have moved their entire campaign headquarters to Calgary, which is kind of their confidence of saying Edmonton's a lock. We got to go fight it out in Calgary. But yes, it will be those 26 seats. Now, again, it's a straight up numbers game. So again, Premier Smith's going to win her seat and Rachel Notley's going to win her seat. So the question becomes then those individual candidates, and there's some very close ridings in Calgary. Some of them have been won by under 1%. Really, some are deeper, but some have been won by under 1%. So the question becomes then, that's where the fight is. That's where I think even all the candidates of both parties that aren't from Calgary are going to be in Calgary campaigning, really trying to kind of win those. Now, from a number standpoint, let's say 40 of the 41 rural seats go to the UCP, then what we need is at least 5 seats of the 26 in Calgary, which I think is very achievable for the UCP. Now, the question becomes, and we could talk about this, is which seats are they? And as well, who's potentially on the block, either side, NDP or UCP for the next election.
And I think for maybe folks out there who perhaps maybe are a little politically complacent, they kind of vote for their party and that's it. Right. Seeing the NDP win a number of years back, coming to terms with the reality that some of those situations we're talking about mere percent, do you think that there's a likelihood that there's going to be an increased sort of political activism? People are going to be concerned, or do you think perhaps that doesn't happen and we see a repeat?
I hope so, Adam. I'll tell you this much. In the last federal election, when I ran and knocked doors in this riding, it blew my mind. And it doesn't matter. We are a democracy. It doesn't matter who you support. Again, we're a democracy. You're allowed to support the party of your choice. But I would love for you to be politically engaged. It's a privilege for all of us as Canadian citizens to be politically engaged. And it blew my mind how many doors I knocked on where they couldn't name their MLA or MP. They couldn't name the party. They couldn't name the individual. So that political apathy is actually really dangerous. And I think that's where we need to really, both parties, but all parties, any party that's running in this election really needs to get out and educate voters. So you're absolutely right. I think that there will be certain areas that will have very high political engagement because they're worried about an NDP government coming in. So you're going to see them come out strong. The interesting thing is, I think the highest voter turnouts I've seen, so I've looked at every single riding in Calgary, some of them are as low as 45% voter turnout. So half the people never left their home to vote. And I mean, I don't, again, like I said, regardless of which party you support, it takes all of 10 minutes, maybe 15 to vote. The government gives you mandatory time off from work to go vote. And it really is a very simple process. So I really think people need to go out and vote. It's a big privilege. It takes 10, 15 minutes to go out and vote. It's a really simple process. But I do hope that there is stronger engagement and people are talking to their neighbors and saying, don't sit this one out. Don't be at home watching Netflix. Go out and get out and vote.
I think you touched on something crucial there, the notion of sort of informed voters, active voters, and that's part of our AlbertaDecides.com coverage for this election. There's been a lot of sort of, whether it be scandal-driven narratives out there or fake outrage reactions to minor limitations on questions while other parties aren't taking questions from certain outlets. We want to sort of shy away, not even necessarily shy away, but skirt all that nonsense. We want to talk policy. We want to talk facts. We want to talk about core issues so that whoever you side with, whichever party you decide to support, you're able to make an informed decision. That's ultimately what we're trying to do. So this, as I mentioned, will be the first of a couple part series. We sort of painted the picture of how this election could be decided. Next time we get together, we're actually going to head into the heart of downtown Calgary. Hopefully we'll be safe. And we're going to talk about what are likely to be some of the core issues for voters in cities, particularly in Calgary, because it's going to be such a close thing. So again, for all of that coverage, make sure you check in regularly at AlbertaDecides.com. Tariq, thanks so much again. Really appreciate it.
My honor, sir.
Great to have your insight. Any final words for the folks out there?
I'd say get out and get informed, right? If there's one thing, worry less about Premier Smith and Rachel Notley and find out who your individual candidate is and first of all, what riding you're in. And you could easily find that out on the Elections Alberta website. Put in your postal code and it'll tell you where you are, who your individual candidate is. I really think that there's some pretty worrisome NDP candidates that are vehemently anti-energy industry running in Calgary. Be aware of that, I would say, is really important. So that's what I would say. Look at the individuals. Don't let those candidates just be filler seats. Let's look at that and go from there.
Awesome. Well, thanks again so much for your time. And everyone at home, thank you so much for tuning in. For Rebel News, I'm Adam Soos. Once again, I am encouraging you to go to AlbertaDecides.com. Set it as a bookmark, check in frequently, because that's where you're going to get all the latest and up-to-date reports on this election, this upcoming election. We're going to get rid of some of the spin of the mainstream media outlets. We're going to focus on the core issues, have important conversations, and ask the questions that you want answers to. So again, go to AlbertaDecides.com.